Well, they didn't give me a script this morning, so I'm going to guess what month it is, but I'd like to welcome you to the November Wake Up Newport. And we're, I think, in line for a very educational morning. And we'll have counselors for those that become too depressed. But we think it's going to be a great day. My first morning responsibility, meaning I have no choice, I have to bring up the self-proclaimed, the only office without term limits, the mayor of the community, Mr. Steve Rosansky.
Don't worry, Russ. You can catch the bus to the Oasis over outside when you're done. Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Rosansky, President and CEO of the Newport Beach Chamber of Commerce. Actually, the mayor of the business community. We won't want Diane to get upset thinking I'm trying to be the mayor. But got a great program for you this morning. I'm glad to see the whole place is full. See what happens when you put in less seats? It looks fuller. So we filled it up. But no, thank you all for coming out.
Well, we are honored this morning to have someone with us from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the executive director of the Western Regional Office. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the world's largest business federation, representing actually more than 300,000 companies, trade associations, and chambers. And most interestingly, 96% of those are businesses with fewer than 100 employees. So it is truly the small business that runs the majority of our economy. Our speaker today, Janine Zimmel, is the executive director of the Western region and is responsible for legislative and political activities in California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Hawaii. And all of that is in support of the U.S. Chamber's policies and public goals that they seek to achieve. He joined the Chamber, the National Chamber, in 2013. And prior to that, he worked in Washington, D.C. with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. So they truly never do die and go away. And the public affairs firm of Mercury, Clark, and Weinstock. And prior to moving to D.C., he worked in California State Legislature and the Assembly, and he also managed and worked on several successful congressional and state legislative campaigns, primarily here in Southern California. He received his master's degree in international affairs from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in political science and German from the University of California at Riverside. So we are here to get an update on the world from Jennings, and we're very excited to have him and welcome him, please, to our dais.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that, and you kind of covered a lot of the stuff that I wanted to open up with, talking about the U.S. Chamber and kind of what we do, but I think that covered just about most of it. And I should really highlight, too, kind of the relationship that we have with local chambers and how we partner with local chambers, because that's such a big part of what we do, and certainly what I do out of the Western Regional Office and working with chambers and other business associations from the 5 states that I cover. Really kind of trying to find ways that we can engage local and state chambers, metro chambers on advocacy and policy issues and making sure that they have a voice not only in Washington, D.C., but then elsewhere in Sacramento, for example, and then also in their city hall and in the counties. It's incredibly important, of course, that the business community is represented, and I think the chambers are really kind of the best tool to make that happen. And quite frankly, when we're getting or trying to get stuff done in Washington, D.C. and working with members of Congress, we wouldn't be nearly as successful as we are if it weren't for the partnership that we have with local chambers on the ground, so that members of Congress not only hear from us in Washington, D.C., which they do pretty frequently, but that they also hear from chambers and other business groups and businesses in particular back in their home states and in their home districts. And so that's why our relationship with chambers like the Newport Beach Chamber is so important. And we've had a strong relationship with Steve and his team for a long time, and we really appreciate that. And it really helps us move the ball forward because at the end of the day, that's what members of Congress are interested in hearing, right? So they're interested most in hearing from the folks back in their district, back home, even though they like to hear from us too in Washington, D.C., but it really makes a big difference what you all do here at home on the ground. So with that being said, the clicker works. This is kind of just an overview of some of the issues that I'm going to talk on. Of course, I'm going to discuss some of the major policy issues that we're working on at the U.S. Chamber, dealing with trade, infrastructure, and immigration. Those are kind of the big three that we like to highlight pretty frequently. And then I'll kind of conclude the talk by discussing how businesses can engage with members of Congress and at the federal level in particular. And then I'll kind of key things up by talking about the environment and the general state of play in Washington, D.C., talk about some of the challenges. I'm sure that a lot of you are aware of some of those challenges, given the fact that they're pretty much broadcast on a daily basis. You all pay attention, especially most of the students here. I'm sure that this is something that you follow pretty closely. So I'll kind of give a brief overview of some of those things, some of the general challenges that we face in Washington when we're trying to get things done. So some of the new challenges that we've seen, of course, there are a lot of pre-existing challenges that we've had for a number of years. Most of you know that polarization in D.C. has been particularly bad of late, and that Congress hasn't been, all that productive, not just this year, but, in a long time as far as the number of bills that are being passed and ultimately signed into law. But this year, of course, we're dealt with another big challenge that we haven't had to deal with in a few years, and that's divided government. The fact that we have, of course, President Trump, a Republican in the White House, and then Congress is split with a Republican Senate and a Democrat House. Like I said, it was difficult enough to get things done back when there was unified control of government under Republicans for the last several years. Now that we have divided government, it's even more difficult. And then, of course, you throw in the impeachment inquiry that is currently going on, and you could argue that that just makes things even more difficult. Of course, 2020, the presidential election that we have looming next year, about exactly 1 year from now. There are a number of other big-time elections that we have to keep our eye on, particularly in the Senate. Some big Senate races in Arizona, places like Colorado, Maine, North Carolina, states like that that'll be interesting to watch in 2020. But that, of course, is going to have a big effect on what can ultimately get done in 2020. A lot of times as issues start to get wrapped up into the presidential politics and to the debates, it becomes a lot more difficult to take votes on some of those issues. Typically, the least productive years for Congress are election years, and so I think that we could probably see that happening in 2020 as well. The capitalism versus socialism debate is something that's interesting, and I can talk more about that as well if anybody's interested at the end of the talk. I won't devote too much time to it now. But that's something that we're kind of keeping an eye on at the U.S. Chamber. It's kind of a growing concern for us, and it's something that's kind of emerging, I think, as we're watching the presidential debates. There's a lot of talk of kind of the leftward lurch of the Democrat Party. In particular, you look at folks like Bernie Sanders, of course, who is a self-avowed socialist, Elizabeth Warren, who kind of shares a lot of the same ideas as Bernie Sanders, very anti-business, anti-free enterprise type ideas that we have to be concerned about at the U.S. Chamber that are going to have large implications for the business community and kind of our overall economic model. Of course, we have folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House. She is, once again, just like Bernie Sanders, a member of the Socialist Party, as is Rashida Tlaib out of Michigan. So those are the two House members that are members of the Socialist Party. So it's not something that's necessarily emerged yet in Congress with full force, but it's kind of an emerging issue, certainly on the Democrat side, and attitudes on socialism are something to be concerned about as well. If you think about it, it's been 30 years. In a couple of days, it'll be 30 years to the date on November 9th from the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we're almost 30 years removed from the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. So a lot of folks, particularly a lot of the folks in this room, weren't around back when the Cold War was taking place. And so I think for younger millennials and a lot of the folks in the Gen Z, what they associate socialism and communism with is very different from what folks that are older that lived through the Cold War and that era associate socialism and communism with. And so it's very important that we talk more about that, and we talk more about the virtues of capitalism and of the free enterprise system. And I think that that's going to be kind of an important debate moving forward. Not necessarily a congressional challenge at the moment, but more of a kind of long-term challenge that we're going to have to deal with at the business community. Impeachment, of course, like I said, that's going to probably be an issue. As far as getting things done, it's going to be a challenge, well, logistically, in that it's going to take a lot of bandwidth. Congress has to devote a lot of time to this. The House is going to try to move impeachment before the end of the year. And then, of course, the Senate's going to have their trial next year, and who knows how long that's going to take. So from a logistical standpoint, it's going to take a lot of time for the House and Senate to move on this, which means that there's going to be less time to tackle other big issues that we'd like for them to tackle. But then, of course, as far as what is its effect on the ability of Democrats to work with Republicans or Democrats to work with the White House, of course, that remains to be seen. Some might even argue, as Congressman Ruda did last month when he was here, that impeachment might make it easier to get certain things done, so that Democrats, particularly freshman Democrats, can show that they weren't just elected to D.C. to impeach the president, but that they actually want to work with the president where they can and work with Republicans to get things done. So we'll see what the ultimate effect is, but certainly from a time standpoint, it's going to be a challenge. And then there are a couple of internal dynamics on the House side with Democrats and Republicans that are challenging for us at the U.S. Chamber. The first is with Democrats, this kind of split between progressives and centrists that we've seen. Like I said, a lot of the momentum and the energy in the Democrat Party is certainly on the far left, the progressive left. And so you see issues like Medicare for All or Keep It in the Ground, which is kind of an anti-natural gas, anti-oil energy policy. These things are kind of, the Green New Deal, stuff like that are gaining more traction, particularly among the progressives in the Democrat caucus. Medicare for All has got obviously a lot of attention at the presidential stage with Elizabeth Warren's plan, but that's kind of become a litmus test issue for Democrats as to where you are on the political spectrum within the Democrat Party. And when you talk about Medicare for All, about half or so of the House and a little less than half of Senate Democrats, about half of Democrats in the House have supported legislation that would essentially create a Medicare for All system. But then there's also a large centrist contingent as well among Democrats in the House, right? So that's the whole reason why they were able to win in 2018 in the midterms and retake control of the House is because of centrists. And of course, Orange County is kind of ground zero for that. Most of the Democrats that were elected here in Orange County and throughout California in 2018 are more moderate centrist Democrats that want to work with Republicans. They want to get things done. They didn't go there to grandstand and make political points and things like that. So it's kind of going to be an interesting dynamic for Speaker Pelosi to have to navigate, in that she has a very energetic kind of left wing of her Democrat Party, and then also a larger contingent even than last year of kind of more centrist, moderate Democrats that really want to produce results. On the Republican side, because of what happened in 2018, the fact that so many centrist Democrats came in, well, they replaced mostly moderate centrist Republicans. And so we're seeing on the Republican side kind of a losing of the middle, where moderates and centrists for the most part lost in 2018, and that's what that chart on the right shows, is kind of where on the ideological spectrum Republicans lie. The Republicans that lost in 2018, where are they? And most of them, as you could see, are those dots on the top. They're to the left of the median Republicans, so that means that they're the more liberal Republicans. Most of those folks are the ones that ultimately lost in 2018, and those were the folks that we really counted on to be bridges to build with or to reach out across to Democrats and get things done on issues like immigration, for example. So that's going to be very difficult now, in that we have a Republican Party that's further to the right, that's more, you look at it geographically, the geographical breakdown, it's certainly more rural, less urban, less suburban, as we saw once again here in California. Republicans, they used to enjoy having a stronghold in most suburban communities throughout the country, and that is no longer the case, where only 30% now of suburban districts are represented by Republicans, which is pretty astonishing. So continuing with the theme of general challenges that we face in DC, of course, the fact that there are few incentives for Congress to work with one another. I mentioned, the Republicans kind of going to the right and this energy on the left with Democrats. It really does mean that, these folks just have fewer and fewer incentives to reach across the aisle. And I think that one of the key charts that I put up here is on the left. When you look at this is from 2018, the key races in the House. Of course, the folks that are in the dark red are the solid Republican seats where, there's virtually no chance of Democrats taking those. That's where you have Republican registration advantages of 15, 20, 30 points. And on the far left, of course, you have the deep blue seats, and that's just the reverse where you have strong Democrat majorities where there's virtually no chance of having a competitive race or a Republican take those seats. And the seats that are in the middle, that are in the light shades of red and blue and in yellow, those are really the seats that are competitive. And there's 435 House seats, and in 2018, about 50 of them were competitive. And that's a real problem for us. And this is continuing a trend that we've seen for the last 20, 30 years where the number of competitive seats, it seems every 2 years, continues to go down and down and down. And so for folks that are from, Republican districts that have plus 20, plus 30 Republican registration advantage, they're not worried about, working with Democrats. They're, as a matter of fact, not really incentivized to work with Democrats because if they do that, then they're going to encourage potentially a primary challenger to their far right. And the same thing you could say for Democrats as well, right? That come from very solidly blue seats have very few incentives to work with Republicans because if they do, then they could expect a challenge from their left flank. And so that disincentive to reach across the aisle and work with one another has really been a problem because so many of the big issues that we're trying to tackle, whether it's trade, infrastructure, immigration, they require Republicans and Democrats to buy in and to develop some sort of bipartisan consensus and support for these issues. And it's hard to do that in this era. So that's kind of the structural reason. And you can go further into that and talk about gerrymandering and all that kind of stuff, I'm sure. But that's kind of the structural disincentive. And then you look at just kind of where society is in general. And that's why I have the chart on the right. I think that's kind of interesting. I mean, a lot of people talk about the fact that they want Republicans and Democrats to work with one another. And that's what I hear most of the time at the U.S. Chamber, talking with folks at the Newport Beach Chamber or other chambers and talking with the business community in general. It seems like almost every meeting you have, you hear somebody say, why can't Republicans and Democrats just work together on these things and find some sort of common sense compromise? And so it sounds like that's where everybody wants to go, but poll after poll indicates that, well, that's not necessarily where the majority of society is. And that's why that chart on the far right shows you that of folks that were polled, 53% prefer their elected official to stick to their positions. 44% want them to make compromises. And you look at, this is across the board for Republicans and Democrats, their view of compromise has gone down. Over the last 10, 15 years, they've done polling over this pretty consistently, and the view of compromise continues to go in a downward direction. More and more folks on both sides of the political spectrum want their elected officials to stand up to the other party and not to work with the other party. So if that's what folks want at the very base level, societal level, well, that's the kind of elected representation that we're going to get. And then it's interesting to see, and this, of course, is particularly now, and things have been polarized over the last several years especially, but you can see kind of how Republicans and Democrats view one another. You have there 45% of Republicans view Democrats as an existential threat to the nation, essentially, and 41% of Democrats view Republicans the same way. Not necessarily helpful when we're trying to build consensus on things. And so a lot of this plays out, the fact that Republicans and Democrats are very much on different pages and now kind of even living in different communities, right? Like I mentioned earlier, there's that geographical split between the two parties. They have different even news sources, Republicans to Fox News or Democrats to MSNBC or whatever you want to call it. That's now being reflected in the issues that matter the most to Republicans and Democrats. And I think that this is kind of one of the more interesting slides that I have, in that it shows on the far left, you see this was from early 2019, a poll conducted of Republicans and Democrats. What issues do they care about the most? And not a whole lot of alignment. And when you see an issue that pops in between in that white space, that diagonal line, that means that Republicans and Democrats are essentially aligned. And the only issue that overlaps there, or there are two, are jobs and Social Security. So about 50% of Republicans and Democrats prioritize jobs, and about 70% of Republicans and Democrats prioritize Social Security. As for a lot of these other issues, there's virtually zero overlap or very little overlap. An example of that would be climate change. So about 70% of Democrats listed climate change as a top priority. 20% of Republicans listed that. So there's a 50-point gap. Terrorism for Republicans, 80% listed that as a priority. For Democrats, it was about 50%, so a 30-point gap. That's an issue, and why that's an issue is that chart to the right. Now, this kind of tracks this is the exact same question. Republicans and Democrats, what are your priorities? And this is from 2019 to 2009 to 1999. And so, 20 years ago, 1999, when they asked Republicans and Democrats this question, the top 5 issues, even though they weren't totally aligned, 4 out of the top 5 matched. In 2009, it was 3 out of the top 5 matched. In 2019, 0 out of the top 5 matched. So they couldn't agree on the Republicans and Democrats on what the top 5 issues facing the country are. So it makes it difficult to tackle the nation's biggest problems when we can't even agree on what the nation's biggest problems are. But there is one thing that Republicans and Democrats seem to agree on, and that's that there's really not a whole lot of interest in tackling the debt or talking about the debt or talking about deficits. And that's kind of a concern, all right? So it's nice to see that Republicans and Democrats can align on something, but this is not the issue that we want them to align on. Deficits have been increasing since 2015. I think we're expecting over $1 trillion deficit, again, for the first time in the last several years this year. So the deficit, the math issue is kind of going in the wrong direction. But when you look at among Republicans and Democrats, what are their views on deficit reduction, or how interested are they in that issue? That continues to go down. Republicans peaked back, right in the midst of the Tea Party movement in 2010, 2012 at 82%. Now they're at 54%, which is, deficit and debt has always been a critical key issue for Republicans, and to see that it gets so little traction now is kind of disconcerting. And among Democrats, it's at 44%. That's a problem because this is, talking about existential threats to the country. Our debt, which we're at, $24 trillion right now, that is an existential threat. That's going to pose huge problems, especially for a lot of the younger folks that are in the room now. I hope Social Security is still around by the time you all retire. But these programs are in really bad shape, and you've probably seen projections out there that say Social Security could go insolvent within 10 years, things like that. Certainly we're not on the positive trajectory that we need to be on. We need to take a more serious look at debt and deficits, because when we're talking about other issues, infrastructure spending, military spending, things that the country has to do, we are going to be less capable of doing those things if we continue to rack up these kind of deficits. So, big problem. So, how does this all translate into the House and Senate agendas? The House agenda, of course, being the Democrat agenda, essentially. The Senate agenda being the Republican agenda. You're seeing, because of, like I said, the lack of overlap between Republicans and Democrats on what issues are important, you see a lack of overlap on, the issues that the House and Senate are prioritizing. So the House likes to complain that they pass a lot of stuff and the Senate doesn't take it up. Of course, that's true. Senate has other priorities, but there's not a whole lot of overlap on these issues. A lot of the stuff that's passing out of the House is really just for show and has absolutely no chance of passing the House or passing the Senate, but also not even really getting a vote. So the issues that are in black are the unique issues. The ones that are in green are the ones that overlap between the House and the Senate. I guess it looks like it's a decent amount, but not really, because you have debt ceiling, budget caps, it's appropriations, it's just funding the government. These are basic functions of government that they have to do regardless. So if you take those out, there's not a whole lot of overlap. Even prescription drugs, there's very different views on kind of how to go about doing that. And then a lot of the other stuff, like especially at the top there with the 2019 House agenda, a lot of those things passed the House, but pretty much went nowhere in the Senate. So moving to our 3 big issues that we're focused on, trade is number 1, 100%. And USMCA is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. I should have put that on there. Otherwise, people think it's the US Marine Corps of America. But it's the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is the NAFTA 2.0, the NAFTA modernization. Of course, NAFTA is an old trade agreement that's been in force since 1994. So it's 25 years old. It was put together before the age of the internet. So it doesn't really tackle things like digital trade or cross-border data flows, stuff like that. Those issues didn't exist in 1993 and 1994. So this does tackle those things, and it maintains tariff-free access for the most part for goods going to Canada and Mexico, which is great. That's one of the best things that came out of NAFTA. Like I said, it updates the rules for digital trade. It upgrades intellectual property protections for American businesses doing business in Canada and Mexico as well. It modernizes customs procedures and customs facilitation so goods can go back and forth across the border more easily and be tracked more easily. Really just kind of common sense stuff that needs to happen and should happen. Big priority of ours. And then, and I'll talk more about that when we go to the next slide. And then the other issue on the trade front, of course, is tariffs. We continue to be very concerned with the effect that tariffs have had on the economy. A lot of you have probably read about that extensively, and they have had an effect. And we see that kind of not only in the stock market, but just in investment levels. Business investment in particular has been down the last couple of quarters, and a lot of that has to do with anxiety over what's happening with China and tariffs. So where we stand right now, and that's what the chart on the right shows, is the amount of tariffs that have been levied against one another. So we have levied tariffs against $370 billion worth of imports from China. Most of that is at 25%. Some of it's at 10%. But that's about 3/5 or so of all imports that we get from China are subject to these tariffs, which is a big, big problem. They, of course, have retaliated against U.S. exports. So $115 billion worth of U.S. exports are now subject to tariffs, Chinese tariffs. And that's about $13 billion worth of exports from the state of California alone have been subject to these tariffs. So we're losing market share in China because of that. Big problem. And then, of course, we have tariffs still out there against the European Union, steel and aluminum that didn't go away against the European Union, and Turkey, India, Russia, and of course they have retaliated with tariffs of their own against our products. So it's a big problem, and it continues to kind of be a drag on overall economic growth in the United States and around the world. There's a new round of tariffs that's supposed to go into effect, 10% on the rest of the imports from China. That would go into effect on December 15th, but there's talk that we might be close to an agreement with China where that wouldn't happen, and that we might even repeal the most recent round of tariffs that went into effect last month. So that would be nice, and then in exchange, China's going to purchase more agricultural products from us, and they're going to take off some of the tariffs they have against our products. That would be good, but we do need to have even more substantive kind of results coming from our discussions with China. A lot of this stems or goes back to issues that businesses have had with China and investing in China for a long time. So intellectual property theft, forced tech and data transfer, things like that, and state-owned enterprises, kind of essentially illegal subsidies from the Chinese government of Chinese businesses. Those have been a big issue and have cost American businesses billions of dollars over the last several decades. And so we're happy that the administration is going after China on these issues, but the tariffs have had a real impact and probably haven't been the most constructive way of doing it. So that continues to be something that we watch. And then going back to USMCA, kind of making the case for USMCA, just here locally, or in the state of California, you had almost $60 billion worth of goods and services exported to Canada and Mexico in 2017. In Orange County, I think it's interesting to note that this is the 5th largest exporting county in California, and about 28% of all the exports that go out of Orange County go to Canada and Mexico. They are our 2 largest trading partners, so even though a lot of people think about the Asia-Pacific region when they think of Southern California trade, Mexico and Canada are still our number 1 and 2 trading partners, so it's important to note. And then here in this congressional district, because wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't put it in congressional terms. This is a big deal in that from this district you had $888 million worth of exports. That's just merchandise exports. That doesn't count services exported to Canada and Mexico. So it's a big deal here in Orange County. To give you a sense of the timeline of where we're at on this, so I think it was mentioned how many days we have until Christmas, 39, something like that. So I keep track of how many days Congress has left in the year. So they have 16 legislative days left. That's it, 16 in Washington, D.C. And of course, they want to do impeachment. They have to fund the government in a couple of weeks. So they're running out of time to get a vote on USMCA. It's possible this could be pushed into 2020, but that would make it extremely difficult to do in a presidential election year. But where we're at is Speaker Pelosi, it's up to her on whether or not she wants to bring USMCA for a vote in the House, and she needs to be reassured from a group of folks, a group of Democrats that have been negotiating with the U.S. Trade Representative, trying to address some of the Democrat concerns. She has to be happy with the results that have come out of that. And then, be confident that about, half or so of her caucus of the Democrats in the House would support USMCA. And if she gets there, then she'll bring it up for a vote. She has said all the right things. She said she wants to do this. She wants to get to yes. So hopefully that'll happen. Republicans are pretty much unified in support on this issue. So it's really the ball is in Nancy Pelosi's court. And hopefully we can get this done this year and then move it to the Senate where it should pass easily. And it would be nice to have a bipartisan win, especially when there's a lot of trade uncertainty, to get this agreement done. That would be great and a big boost to the economy. So this is just kind of going over, if you want more information on USMCA, we have the two websites there, usmcacoalition.org, chamber.com/USMCA. We have all kinds of stuff, state by state, industry sector by industry sector. You can also send a letter directly to your congressional representatives through those websites. We encourage letters to the editor, social media. As much noise as we can make on this issue, we have to make. There are a lot of targets here. I mean, Congressman Harley Ruda, for example, is somebody that I think would be open to supporting USMCA. He said a lot of really good things on it, but he needs to hear, just like the rest of the congressional delegation, they need to hear from you all on the ground. That really makes a big difference. So the two other issues that I'll touch on really quickly, infrastructure. I could touch on this one pretty quickly because, even though our infrastructure policy folks wouldn't be very happy with my assessment, nothing's happening on infrastructure this year. Next year, maybe. What they do have to do is they have to do a FAST Act reauthorization. That's just the surface transportation bill that expires. But what we'd like to see at the U.S. Chamber is a larger, more ambitious infrastructure plan that really addresses our nation's needs. I mean, we haven't increased the federal gas tax in over 20 years. It's been 1993 or almost 20 years. 1993 was the last time that we did that, or more than 20 years. Jeez, okay, yes. More than 20 years. So we have to make an adjustment there. The federal gas tax doesn't go nearly far enough in paying for our roads and maintaining our critical infrastructure in this country. So we need to tackle that. We need to talk about permit streamlining and finding a way to get projects online quicker, developing a skilled workforce that can work in the construction trades. We've put together a 4-point plan that we've offered to Congress and offered to the administration that we'd like to see them tackle. And even on the federal gas tax issue, we've even advocated for a slight increase to the federal gas tax as well, even though that might not be particularly popular among certain folks. It's something that we absolutely have to do, and that would get us about $400 billion or so, which we could then leverage, hopefully, into about $1 trillion for a major infrastructure package. And the need is pretty clear. I think most of you kind of know, just driving down the roads or going to the airports, how much of a mess it can sometimes be, and obviously having to pay for repairs on your cars because you're getting alignment issues or your tire pops because of holes that are in the road. These are big issues that kind of hit us in our wallets and in our pocketbooks. So we need to do something about this. State of California infrastructure, not very good, C- pretty much across the board, Ds and Cs. Not a big surprise, I think, to anybody in this room, but we have to get serious about coming up with a solution. Immigration, of course, that is always an issue that we talk about, and this will be the last one. We've been talking about the need to do immigration reform for 10, 15 years, whatever it's been. I feel like a broken record having this conversation all the time. But we absolutely need to come up with a solution here. We'd like to see comprehensive immigration reform that tackles everything from border security to our visa programs to dreamers and what to do with the folks that are undocumented that are currently here in the United States. We'd like to see Congress actually tackle that. I'm not going to be overly optimistic that that's going to happen, but hopefully there will be some sort of a compromise, at least on dreamers, the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and border security. Hopefully there will be some movement there. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court might take up, or probably will take up, the DACA case next year. So that is on whether or not the administration could cancel the DACA program. And so if the Supreme Court takes that up, maybe Congress will be compelled to do something. But it's a big issue that we need to tackle, and the chart on the left shows a working age population. If you look at the U.S.-born working age population, that continues to go down. U.S. birth rates, of course, are down across the board, pretty much below replacement levels. That continues to be a problem. We have more and more folks, baby boomers in particular, that are obviously entering retirement, and less folks that are going to be paying into the system that are going into their prime working age years. And really, most of the growth that we're going to see in the United States among the working age population is going to be from immigrants and the children of immigrants. And so, we need to make sure that we come up with a solution for these folks, in particular for dreamers. You have about 700,000 dreamers who, of no fault of their own, of course, were brought to this country and are essentially, Americans, very much think of themselves as Americans. We need to find a solution for these people to continue to live and work in the United States. And at a time when we're at 3.5% unemployment, the last thing that we need to do is take 700,000 people out of the workforce. We absolutely can't afford to do something like that. So there's an economic reason, there's a moral reason why Congress needs to tackle this issue. And hopefully they'll do it, if not next year, hopefully soon. So lastly, just where business can make a difference, I want you all to know that you all can make a difference, absolutely. Just reaching out to your members of Congress regularly, trying to, whether it's through the chamber or individually, having meetings or participating in various events and forums. I know Congressman Ruda was here speaking at the same breakfast last month. Making connections with them, talking to them, doing more issue forums, things like that, making sure that he gets to know the business community and the business community gets to know him. That's critically important to develop those kind of relationships. At the U.S. Chamber, what we're doing is we've kind of changed our scorecard on how we assess members of Congress, and we're trying to find new ways really to incentivize bipartisanship. So I talked a lot about bipartisanship. And really we're focused on how do we rebuild the governing middle? How do we get folks in the middle Republicans, those centrist Democrats, to work together to come up with solutions to tackle these big problems? And so we've changed our scorecard to give credit for being bipartisan. So, co-sponsoring bills that were authored by the opposite party, for example, you'll get points on things like that. And so we're trying to kind of, at the U.S. Chamber, figure out ways that we can do that. But I think that just more and more the business community in general is going to be looked at as the voice of reason, the voice in the middle that can bring folks together. We're about getting things done. We're not about, grandstanding or making political points. Obviously, that's not what we do. That's not what we can afford to do as the business community. We don't have time to do that stuff. We need Republicans and Democrats to get serious, work together on these issues. And there are a lot of ways that, obviously, the business community can engage, and I appreciate you, Steve, bringing me out here today to talk with everybody, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Well, I think certainly you can see how complex of a political environment we're in at this point in time. If you haven't been totally depressed, I'm sure we can come up with something else. But we do live in a strange time that if you pay attention to everything, sometimes you can't sleep at night. Reagan, one of his favorite jokes was always the two gentlemen, the English gentlemen that got in the elevator at the same time to go up to their floors to work and always got in the elevator to come down at the same time. And they were always dressed so proper in the morning when they got in, and then when they came back in the evening, the older gentleman was still dressed properly, but the younger gentleman, his tie was askew, his shirt was open, his jacket was back on his back, and he was generally a mess. And one evening, he turned to the older gentleman and he said, "How can you come to work and stay so collective in listening to all of this that's going on and look so proper going home?" And the older gentleman thought for a minute and he said, "Who listens?" So, I think we have to have a balance to keep our sanity of pay attention to what you want to pay attention to and what you think is the most important, and then get involved in it. So is there someone standing to my side over here? He's always here. I would like to bring back to the podium the Honorable Mayor of the Business Community the person we all love and have friendship with. What's your name again?
Thank you, Russ. All right, just quickly. Thank you. Yeah, you know, I like gum on my shoe. I can't get rid of them. Just to close out quickly here, we have a few events coming up. So our next major event of the year is we've rebranded it. It's called Newport Chamber Honors, and it's our Citizen of the Year and Business Person of the Year. This is the first year that the Chamber's selected a Business Person of the Year, and that's Jim Walker. Anybody at the Bungalow Restaurant? Any of you folks? Well, the owner of the Bungalow Restaurant is our Business Person of the Year, and Nancy Gardner, a former city councilwoman that Rush and I both served with on city council, is our Citizen of the Year. That'll be November 15th at the Balboa Bay Resort, and there's still tickets available if you're interested in joining us. Our monthly business education luncheon will be on November 20th at Fleming's. That's from 11:30 to approximately 1 or 1:30. Lindsay Lowell, it's a tongue twister. Lindsay Lowell will be our speaker. She's a chamber member. She's going to be talking about influencers and social media. That's all the rage these days. If you want to be in business, you got to be on social media, and influencers will blow up your business if you can get them to promote it. So you want to learn how to get in touch with those people. That's on the 20th of November, as I said. Our Government Affairs Committee meeting this month will be on the 21st at the Chamber's offices. We'll be having a representative from the U.S. Census. If you don't know, every 10 years, actually, a lot of you students probably don't know this. Every 10 years, they count how many people are in the United States, and that has big implications on a lot of the things that Jennings talked about today, because that's how they divide up how money is spent all over the country by population, how representatives are allocated. So we may lose 1 or 2 representatives in Congress here if we don't have, if they count less residents here in California than the last time, or at least on a proportionate basis, or more. And then it's usually a problem because certain people that are here may not want to be counted. Maybe they're, for whatever reason, they don't want to respond to the census. So they're going to be talking about that. Our next mixer is November, actually we changed the date on that, right? 21st. So you can be with us in the morning for Government Affairs, mixer in the evening. We don't know the location yet, but we will have one for sure. And then our next Wake Up Newport meeting, December 5th, here in this room, Assemblywoman Cotty Petrie-Norris will be talking about things happening up in Sacramento and how they affect us down here. And last but not least, Christmas Boat Parade, December 18th to the 22nd this year. So we'll see you out in the harbor. If you're not a member of the Chamber of Commerce, you should be. Have a great month, and we'll talk to you next month.